Vision. Following clues left by our ancestors, we unbury the past to reveal a knowledge of unfathomable value, putting us just a little closer to our own true birthrights. From the secret history of a possible bloodline of Jesus Christ, to secret history of America's founders, to the secret history of extraterrestrial interaction on our planet, here to bring light to the night. Your host for Night Vision Radio, Renee Barnett.
Hey everyone, welcome once again to Night Vision. If this is your first time joining us, a double welcome to you. So glad that you could join us tonight. I wanted to do something a little bit different tonight. You know, here we try to shine a light on history because, as we all know, history is written primarily by the victors. So we try to weed through what's there and figure out the real deal. You know, I often say that we are trying to untwist history a little bit. And, you know, most of the people that you read about or study in history are obviously going to be people who are famous and well-known people, royals and aristocrats and high-ranking politicians and clergy. But, you know, when it comes to affecting change in the world, it's really more the everyday Joe and Jane like you and me. I'm assuming you are an everyday Joe or Jane. I certainly am. And so it's the people that are not in power that generally band together and affect change. In many cases, it's affected through a revolution. And there are certain triggers for revolutions, including our own American Revolution. And so we're going to be talking about what brings on a revolution and sort of look at it through the lens of the times and also through current times and see if we see any links. You know, we hear a lot about the idea of a revolution in America and people banding about the term 1776 and all that. But I wonder how many people really know what that revolution was really all about. And I think there's some misinformation out there. So I would love to straighten some of that out. So I've got two really great people. First, I'm going to bring on our good old Night Vision historian, James Martin. And hey, James, how are you?
Very well, Renee. Yes, all's good. I hope everyone else is doing well in the evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time it is.
Wherever you are. And I forgot to mention, this is Night Vision on the road. I am not in America at the moment. And so that explains the different background, but and also the different time of day. So I'm doing some work with James right now over in Europe, and we're doing some research, going to be working on our website. So we should have some new things up pretty soon. And hopefully you'll go and check it out. That's newrennies.org. We'll give that out again later, and also our email address, so that if you have questions or any suggestions for anything you'd like us to cover, there we go. newrennies.org, and just write to us there and give us your ideas, any suggestions for shows that you'd like us to cover, or periods in history, particular events, or anything like that. We'll be happy to rake through it for you and tell you what we come up with. But now our special guest tonight is someone that James has arranged. And I think it's only fitting that he should introduce the guest tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to James.
Well, I'd like to introduce Sean Halsall, who's a British trade unionist and politician, and very knowledgeable on the topic that we're covering tonight, which is the peasants are revolting, the notion of and you can take that in two ways. But really, the idea that revolution, what makes a revolution, with some key terms, and I couldn't think of anyone better than Sean. Hi, Sean.
Hi, James. Hi, Renee. Thank you for having me and inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so happy you came. That's great. Welcome to Night Vision.
Thank you very much.
So, I thought, because we do have we have a worldwide audience, but we have a lot of Americans, being that the show is based primarily in America. So I thought, if you don't mind, we might start with the American Revolution, because this has been coming up a lot lately in our politics. And I just feel like maybe some people have the wrong end of the stick and aren't really aware of what really was going on with the American Revolution, what really caused it. And James and I have been talking the last couple of days, and he's given information to me that I was not aware of. So, I have to think that I'm not the only one, and that other people could benefit from what the two of you can share with us. And I was laughing earlier, saying to James, let's see, yeah, we got two Brits, telling us about American history. But in a way, it's kind of a good thing, because it's like a more objective view. It's like you're looking at it, sort of, from a distance, even though there is a huge relationship here, particularly when we're talking about the revolution. But hopefully you guys are over that by now, and and you will give us an unjaundiced look at the American Revolution.
Well, make America Great Britain again, I think was that was the slogan, wasn't it?
I saw that somewhere.
It wasn't in my office.
Yeah. What was the deal? I mean, we've heard these terms, Boston Tea Party, taxation without representation, and all that. But I think most of us just don't dig to figure out exactly what that was all about. It wasn't really about tea, was it?
No, not really. In fact, nothing to do with tea at all. I suppose you like with anything, you've sort of got to start off with the notion of what America is, and by the time of the revolution, you've got the eastern seaboard of the what we call the United States today, 3 million people living there. And some very difficult situations, really. You've got a constant battle for survival. America's founded, I have to say this, but in Britain, we tend to think of prison colonies as being Ireland or Australia. Well, actually, so to say this, everyone, it was the colonies of the British North America, where even the founding fathers were booted out as criminals from Britain for being too religiously extreme. Now, obviously, over time, it wasn't just criminals or anything like that, and that did begin to slow down somewhat in terms of transporting people, literally taking people off the street and dumping them in another country. One example was someone who was from the county of Lancashire, in northern England, a grandmother who'd lost her daughter and was bringing up her grandchildren, who, for the crime of taking 2 slices of bacon from a market stall, was transported, literally removed from one country and transported overseas. Wow. And the existence that people had was it wasn't easy. You have, well, let's face it, there were people already there who weren't best pleased with a load of Europeans suddenly arriving and saying, oh, this is ours now. But you have a situation whereby people are surviving not living. They're on the frontier, really, of a place that, in America, you say from sea to shining sea. Well, no one knew that there was another sea. Renee, you're from California. What's that in this period? It's this great wilderness, and one bad harvest can see radical increases in poor health and all of this. And that really is the situation that people are in prior to the revolution. There were food riots, and I just bring this up now. I know we'll come to it, but there is a real relationship between the cost of food, or how much you spend on food, against your income, and the idea of revolution. So the situation was this, that, there were food riots. There was about 30 food riots before the American Revolution and during. And a lot of those riots were led by women, but I'm sure we can come on to this later. Sean, I don't know if we
could just go back just a second, Sean. I'm sorry, but you said that they shipped over people that they felt were criminals, but also that were religious fanatics or religious extremists. And who were those people? What religions were they practicing that they were considered extreme? Was it just because they didn't want to come under the English church, or what was it?
Well, we call them Puritans, essentially, not wishing to offend anyone, so I'll just be careful with my language, but, puritanical, relatively extreme Protestants who were at the time in England quite a large force. They certainly contributed to the English Civil War. And there were more than one of those, but they were really at the time of the restoration of Charles II, and beforehand, by the way, were seen to be too extreme for Britain. So if you look at James I, or James VI of Scotland, as I prefer to call him, he was relatively puritanical himself. He certainly believed in a lot of religious doctrine. But the issue for him was there was sort of this breakaway sect who really wanted to live literally as the Bible instructed. And they were causing some religious disruption in a country that had been through wars of religion. It was in the collective memory, the split between Henry VIII and the Pope, and then Elizabeth founding the Church of England. And then we have a civil war, again caused by food, and again by starvation and all of this. And there were different factions that believed during the English Civil War, the reason that we've been driven to raise up against the monarchy is because, well, if we don't, we die, in essence. Now, you have different factions trying to explain away the reason for the situation that they're in, just like today. And some of those extreme factions were the ones that were told, right, well, we've just discovered some land over the Atlantic. Obviously, there was no one there. And off they went. They were told, leave. And actually, in terms of the founding fathers, there were colonies already in. There were plantations, essentially, but there were colonies already in the Americas. There was an attempt as a land grab, but one of the problems with that was lack of understanding of different weather systems and what would grow there, etc. So famously, you've got Jamestown. Good name, that. But you've got Jamestown, and you've got some other attempts, Roanoke Island and all of this, to settle. But the problem is you've got very different weather systems, and you've got different soils and all of this. So it's very difficult to generate a colony. And the idea was then, well, we can help with this situation by getting rid of some of the unwanted from Great Britain and transporting them overseas. And of course, then with that import of so-called prisoners, so-called criminals. I mean, they really weren't. They just thought differently, I suppose. But of course, what was then sent over was the aristocracy. And so you have, for example,
somebody's got to be in charge, of the great unwashed.
Exactly. So you've got
can't take care of themselves.
You've got the Earl de la Warr, who founds Delaware, and you have other governors, royal governors, who are really ruling it as their own little fiefdom.
Yeah. So, Sean, what can you add to that? And do you agree with what James said about the way that things were sort of going on at that time?
Yeah, 100%. I think, though, there's always two narratives going on at the same time. There's the narrative of the aristocracy and trying to paint it as to fit in with whatever narrative they would like to. And there's a narrative of the working class who are often in a struggle for their lives, trying to make sure they've got food and heat and stuff. And they react due to much more base instincts and often the aristocracy or people trying to lead these movements steer it in the direction that they would like it to go. Not always successfully, but that tends to be the narrative that happens in almost every revolutionary movement.
Yeah, and I guess obviously the idea of the revolution itself, the fight itself, and then the founding of a separate nation here. In my understanding, this was partially, if not in large part, to establish a separation between church and state. And I think most Americans, or many Americans, believe that this country was founded on Christian principles, which I don't have anything negative to say about, except that it just wasn't the case. In my understanding, what do you say about that?
Well, I think when you're looking at the foundation of a religious state, again, just to come back to Sean's point, with for a majority of people, they have left one place, they're in another, and they are having to farm and they are having to work very, very hard to survive. I mean, it's sort of to paint a picture, you're looking at between 6 and 13 children per family having to be sired just to keep the population going. I mean, there's a lot of death. We can't underestimate really the effects of infant mortality on a family. This is that very harsh reality, and of course the explanation. This is just before the Enlightenment, I suppose. The reality is most people thought, well, this is due to God. Now, which iteration of God, sort of comes in a little bit later. But, for a lot of people, there was also then an attraction to the Americas. And this was this idea that, well, whilst it's a royal colony, Britain's months away, so there is a little bit of this idea of freedom here, and and I think there's a little bit of that going on in the run up, from the late 1600s, 1700s, that there is a bit of freedom to do what you wish, and there are a lot of Protestant immigrants who were coming from Holland. Of course, Holland, or the Netherlands, founded New York. I suppose the Swedish will take a claim there as well. But, New Amsterdam, and I think it was Gothenburg, correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But they've established places. It's Protestant. It's not, Catholic doctrine or anything like that. But that's this idea. And there is a bourgeois. So if we break down that, essentially money-loving, capitalist, literally in favor of capital or cash, in other words, beginning to develop, who are expecting imports from overseas. Well, obviously, there's no other type of import of finer goods. And you see a change from subsistence farming then into things like growing of tobacco and of sugar to essentially sell to that bourgeois class, as it were.
And also, just jump in there, and your first generation people who are going over there, they're not going to be the risk averse of the bourgeoisie. They're going to be risk takers and sort of these expeditionary renegades. So it's that sort of mentality is built in as well, and those sort of people tend not to like to follow rules.
They might have thought, it's going to be a free-for-all, over there, because there obviously would be much, much less oversight just by very nature of geography. So I can see how it might have been quite an adventure.
And it's worth noting as well what's going on in Europe at this time. As in the medieval period, you've got a lot of rivers that are polluted with, just leave that to your imagination, but excreta and stuff. You've got a lot of overfishing going on in the seas, and due to land ownership from the aristocracy. I'm just thinking about France and Britain here. You've got farming that's essentially directing food away from the farmers who don't own the land. That food is going to the aristocracy for them to sell for a profit and not to the hands of workers. And I suppose in that situation of a food scarcity, there is also a drive to take those risks. That perhaps this newfound land, or Newfoundland as we call it today, to go over and perhaps try your luck on building a better life. And there's no doubt some people did, but again, these are people who are not just religious in this way or risk averse, but they're also people who quite like the idea of getting as far away from absolute monarchy, absolute control as possible.
So when this idea of revolution started to bubble up, that was probably a very attractive part of it to people wanting to start anew. But wasn't there some talk of installing a king? And wasn't that offered actually to George Washington?
Well, it was offered to George Washington. I mean, we're skipping ahead in the story slightly, but actually it was offered to one of the princes of Prussia, if you must know. And the French, who were allies with the American revolutionary, I'm trying not to say colonists here, but, to the new United States, there were various messages sent via France to the Prussian royal family to ask them if they wanted to donate one of their princes over to the Americas. I think I should really argue that at this point, no one's not wanting to be British. If we take the years, the 1720s, let's say, there isn't a desire to not be British. There is a little bit of thanks in terms of the security. But the constant warfare in Europe, and later, actually, I think one of the instigators, other than food scarcity, food riots for the working class of the colonies, was, of course, what's known as Queen Anne's War, if you want to call it, or the French and Indian War, as it's sometimes called in the United States. So this massive expansion right the way up to, I think, the Mississippi of the American colonies. And there was the repayment required, the high cost of that war, that protection that was required from the colonists and expected, actually, even by the likes of Benjamin Franklin. And we can speak about him in a little bit. This cost was then borne by the people on the continent. So you had you had the beginning of the taxation that increased prices, restricted knowledge, etc. Sean, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to jump to the stamp duties and stuff like that, and the taxation put on learning and education. Really, I think that is a much bigger trigger than what happened in Boston with a few crates of tea being thrown into the river. But I think a lot of the founding fathers would have at least seen themselves as Enlightenment thinkers and were very much sort of following some of the traditions of the French and European thinkers there, and certainly influenced by them. I mean, Benjamin Franklin was a big fan of the French and their thinkers.
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at this in another way. This sort of foundation, apart from, you did have a lot of puritanical sects who were quite happy to, they've left persecution in Britain, but let's make no mistake, we're persecuting people. You want to have a look at the Salem witch trials and various other witch trials for examples of that. But there is, in that liberation, I suppose, of being far away from royal authority, things that would be seen as, heretical, things that would be seen as seditious against that authority. Well, what we're talking about here is the explosion of literacy in the American colonies at this point. People are reading, and reading quite a lot. There is an explosion of newspapers, print press, and all of this in the colonies. And as soon as there's the stamp tax, a tax on knowledge, essentially, this becomes one of the real triggers. On top of the hardships and on top of everything else, one of the real key triggers for the revolt.
So how did, there were people obviously in America that fought against the revolution, that wanted to stay with the monarchy. And I'm wondering, just sort of looking at it in terms of today, and things like the Civil War in the United States, how people were very divided. People, families were broken up and I'm wondering if that was the case back then. Were there neighbors against neighbors, or was it more the consensus of the people here that they wanted the revolution?
Can I just jump in there, James? I think it's to frame it as people weren't happy with the Americans is wrong. The people were fighting what they saw at the time, I imagine, terrorists or insurgents who were trying to, they were very British. They saw themselves as British. America wasn't an idea yet. So they see themselves as probably defending their country against people trying to tear it from their grasp. So you've got to look at it in the context of that, and not how we look back now with history, how it's being written, because they weren't to know what America would become at the time.
Yeah, and it really is this interesting thing in a revolution where if you're in a two things, if you're in a country, what makes you break the laws of the land? What pushes you to that state? Now, most people think of revolution in a negative way. They think of revolution as being, Sean said, terrorists. It
can be. It can be.
It can be, but there's a tipping point where the notion of revolution stops being about terrorism and bloodshed and begins to be romantic. So you end up seeing a lot of symbology, the creation of symbols, and that includes flags, and that includes, mysterious histories and, tales from far, long ago, that kind of stuff, and the romanticism behind it. But I suppose the the question. I mean, my argument would always be revolutions due to, when you've got nothing other than death, you revolt. But I do appreciate that. Well, what is it that makes that change from the view of a revolt, a revolution, become something romantic and this heroic struggle? And we shouldn't look through our glasses today. We need to consider how they were thinking. They were British. And yes, there were demands for, no representation without taxation is actually, if you think about it, a request to be taxed. Just, to have elected officials taxed. And it's not as simple as that. The Boston Tea Party, yes, you can say it's to do with tariffs. Actually, it wasn't just tea that was dumped. It was because of a blockade. The Port of Boston had been shut, and that was the lifeline of the imports of food. As a port town.
We just had that here recently at the southern border. We had our border blocked by the governor of Texas, not allowing the trucks to come in, and costing something like the people of Texas like $4 billion. And then what's happened now is that Mexico found a different route. So now Texas has lost all those revenues. But it's amazing how history repeats itself all the time. It's like, I see parallels. I may be looking at them incorrectly, but it certainly looks like that to me. So they were having trouble getting things through, or it was just so high priced, or both?
Well, in Boston, the port was shut. And the port was shut, as a revenge for, I think, I can't remember exactly where, but an attack on, or alleged attack on some soldiers. So what we will do is we'll shut the port down. So the livelihood of that city was shut down by the British, because, let's be honest. Britain's empire's expanding, and the way that Britain dealt with workers who were not best pleased with another country planting a flag there was, well, we have guns, you don't, so they thought that would work. I mean, I put it this way, if it had, we'd be talking about the Boston Revolt, not the American Revolution.
Right.
Yeah, and in Boston, when them soldiers were attacked, there was a gun went off, killed a civilian, was that right? And that sparked a bit of a riot there, which, as usual in most of these revolutions, the pinch point is a soldier's gun going off somewhere and a civilian being killed.
Wow.
Well, Tunisia would be a good example with Mr. Azizi, who had lost his job 2014. 2011. Lost his job, became a fruit vendor, and was, bullied around by some soldiers. A gun went off, he died. And the trigger point there was, well, we're starving. They started to launch fruit at the soldiers, beginning the Tunisian revolution that led to the Tunisian constitution in 2014.
Did you say lobbing fruit?
Throwing fruit, yes.
Yeah. We had something just in the news this week.
You get two Brits on, and we're already straight back to lobbing fruit.
That's funny. So, what was going on in England? How did the average citizen see the American Revolution, or did they really keep up with it or know about it that much? Did they not care, because it was such a far-flung wilderness?
was brilliant to stop people revolting in your own country, because the one thing that soldiers get is fed, they get healthcare, and a bit of travel. And the reality is, whilst when you look at warfare in this way, we think of battles and all of that, but when you hear the word siege, that's a lot of sitting around not doing too much. The medieval period, for example, you spent 40 days. Good luck if you got a siege, because after 40 days service, off you went back home. Now, things are obviously different in this period, but you're looked after. And if you're what's going on in Britain at the time, I mean, we were just talking before, we came on air with the idea that, why has Britain not had a revolution? And I don't accept that. It did. We just call it the Industrial Revolution. We had a situation where the first industrialized cities, Manchester in the north of England, producing a lot of cotton, and that, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution have already started by the time of the American Revolution. So, how was it seen in Britain? Well, here we go again, another revolt. In Britain, it hadn't been too long since the Jacobites, the descendants of James II, had revolted and were trying to install him back on onto the throne. You've just had a war with France again, and this is initially seen as a revolt, and nothing much will come of it.
Yeah, again, it's in the context of the time where Britain had a massive empire, and it will be a mistake for us to look back and think of America as it is now. It was a small colony in a big empire, so it's not going to be that important for the people here who are looking all around the world at where at any one point there's something kicking off somewhere. There's revolt on the edge or happening somewhere in the empire.
Yeah, and you, James, earlier apologizing for using the term colony. To Americans, that word doesn't have really negative connotations. It's like we don't automatically think, oh, that means someone's gone and seized some land and set up their own thing. It's like, we have the story of the 13 original colonies and all that, and it's not a dirty word here. It's amazing. I know we were talking earlier about how words can mean so different things, to different people, and that, some words get really stigmatized, but amazingly, colony or colonizing is not stigmatized like that here in America.
Well, it's probably because you got rid of the colonizers.
Maybe.
But even the uprising and this idea of taxation and representation and all of this, I think it's a little bit more romantic than what was actually going on at the ground. To the ordinary folk, I mean, we can't underestimate what poverty is like. People who are impoverished for many reasons, often to do with government, tend not to vote differently or act differently in fear of losing what little they have.
Yeah.
And we can't underestimate that this is going on at the time. By the way, a lot of the food riots that were going on and continued throughout the revolution were led by women. Women were expected to cook, and without any food, this is at the time, without any food, what exactly are they cooking? I mean, we're mentioning Boston. Well, when the British evacuated Boston in 1776, there were 14 food riots. And if you want to read more on that, I don't think we have long enough to go into it. But read Abigail Adams.
Not embarrassingly, not familiar with the food riots, really. I'd love to know, if you could, one of you could explain, what did that look like? What were they doing? Were they out in the streets with big spoons, or, I mean, what did the food riots look like?
Well, are you happy for me to take this, Sean?
Yes, you take that, James. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I say, the 14 riots, and one of them was due to a food merchant, Thomas Boylston, who had risen the price of coffee and sugar by removing them from sale, so making them appear scarce, and then sort of suggesting, "Oh, I've just found some, but it's going to cost you a little bit more."
Right.
And the 24th of July, 1777, this was a group of angry women demanded a reasonable price for the coffee. This was more than 100 people, 100 women who had marched down to his warehouse, demanded the keys. He refuses. One of them grabbed him by the throat, threatening to scramble him, threw him into a cart. He then eventually gives the keys over, and they hoist the coffee out themselves. Now, coffee, we think of it as a luxury. Well, hold on a second. Coffee and sugar at this point are incredibly addictive. Well, they are addictive now. So these are essentially addicts who are looking for their fix of coffee. And shortly after this, you've got riots again relating to sugar and all of this around the colonies. But we should also say that, using utensils, anything they could get hold of to demand access to food. Again, war and revolt and disruption for people who want to make money, bourgeois or capitalist, however you want to describe them. Don't mistake that war is very profitable for some people, just not the people.
Right.
And again, I may be wrong here, James, but we see similar things during the French Revolution with women leading food riots, and again in the Russian Revolution. It's almost similar thread going through when we see women leading riots over the lack of food. So I think that's an interesting sort of thread that runs through history.
It really is. But it does make sense because women were the ones, preparing the food and, feeding their families. And it must have been really tough to, have an empty cupboard and hungry children.
And where's the money coming from?
Coffee or sugar.
Well,
that's when I would riot myself.
Where's the money coming from? I mean, even 20, 30 years after the British are booted out, and you've got the Treaty of Paris. The early United States are still using the British pound. Now, Britain's got control of your currency. Where's the money coming from? Where's the work coming from? If you have crossed that line from, I've been agreeing and abiding the laws and restrictions of the time. I mean, the second president of the United States, John Adams, I mean, he was working with the British. I mean, he was a lawyer, and it takes quite a bit for him to decide, that he's going to, suddenly betray his country. Ben Franklin, sort of has it forced upon him when he's called a traitor kind of thing. But, there were a lot of people who didn't want any declaration of independence. They just wanted some continental congress maybe, or something like that. There isn't an idea that you don't want to be British again. It's just this notion of we've been driven to this,
right? And we're being treated unfairly, basically. So yeah.
So
that's interesting.
So the thread that comes through, you've got women You have hunger. You have an idea of laws being unjust. Hardships of reality. Again, one bad harvest, and you can say goodbye to quite a number of your children, family members. There's no healthcare. I note that still remains the case. There's things like this. It's really hard, and something switches. Now, you see the development of, symbols, Colombia, you have all of this. But it is worth noting that the people who founded the revolutionaries are all Masons.
Yes.
Ultimately, with their loyalty to some lodge in England. So it gets a little bit murky then when you begin to look at it like that. But, I digress.
It also contributes to that idea, that the country was not founded on any particular religious doctrine, because, I think it's founded more on Masonic ideas.
Yeah, I think for any revolution to stay stable and progress afterwards, you need to almost set a narrative and control that narrative and make a story up afterwards to make it seem like this was always meant to happen and this was always the end goal, rather than just, as almost every revolution is, just a spark that lights something out of control and burns and the chips fall where they will when the people afterwards come in and then paint that narrative. But it all depends on how that narrative is painted to how quickly it calms down and things settle down again. As obviously when we get onto France, we'll see it was a little bit different and more turbulent there for a while.
Yeah.
Well, this is the point of revolution, though. Nobody sits down and goes, right, everyone, we've got a planning meeting at 10 o'clock. Let's discuss what happens afterwards. It doesn't happen like that. You have a diaspora of thoughts. Again, people in very desperate situations who have lots of different ideas as to what's to happen. You can see this as the notion, there's sort of a breaking point of, if we lose this revolt, and there have been lots of revolts against governments in history, most of them are put down, most brutally. It happens today. You expose government corruption and you're imprisoned and then deported. Sound familiar? You don't know which period I'm talking about here.
No.
But there's a breaking point of, if we go past this point of no return and start saying, okay, we want independence, we are not British. There's a lot of very uncomfortable people at this time. You have a look at some of the states. I think it was New York, I think, abstained from the initial vote on independence. I can't recall. There were other states who, weren't happy with it at all. There was a fear that New York would dominate against the Carolinas. You really have old governors. You have old provinces, old colonies with very different outlooks on life, trying to come together on a common cause. This is the issue with revolutions generally. There isn't anyone planning things. There are just multiple uprisings that eventually coalesce. Sometimes, we get to the Russian Revolution, there's a criticism of intelligentsia thinkers. We'll just break down some of these lines.
Today, here in America, people are criticized for being overeducated. How can you be overeducated?
You've got another argument here, though, which is the root cause of the American Revolution based in working class struggle, one. And secondly, when it comes to the so-called bourgeois, the middle class, whatever you want to call it, really, is actually the thing that coalesces everyone together is a revolt that how dare the British tax our knowledge?
Right.
You know, this is a revolution about intelligence and our right not to tax pamphlets and leaflets and newspapers, etc. Should just note that the Stamp Acts still exist in Britain and we still pay stamp duties. We didn't get rid of it. But, you know, that's the idea. And as I would note, there's some hesitancy. I'm going to mention the word communist. I think hopefully not lost most of the audience, but the word communist is interesting. You know, it means essentially no capital, no money. So there's no there hasn't been a country that's tried communism yet. You know, Russia still had the ruble, Cuba still has its currency. But I just want to say there was a notion from Lenin, who was one of the Russian revolutionaries, eventually the leader of the Soviet Union. And he calls for a permanent revolution. Well, I've just got to say this to you. That notion of a permanent revolution didn't come from Lenin. It came from your founding fathers, who had proposed, actually, that there should be a revolution every 30, 40 years. Certainly, France adopted that. But, you know, there should be a constant churning up to stop corruption and to make sure there is some idea of representation. I just want to say on the government of the United States that in terms of how revolutionary it is, the Electoral College was based upon the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, wasn't an empire. They had electors who were prince electors. And that was the idea, to try and stop dictators from taking over the presidency, was to have these electors who made the decision on behalf of the workers of this new United States.
Yeah, we need to get rid of that.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. But, you know, let's make no mistake that what we've got is, you know, there was a debate about whether or not to have an elected monarchy. So I don't know what that would be, King George IV of the United States or something like that.
How can you elect a monarch? I guess you could, but, you know, mostly isn't that bloodline stuff? It's their birthright.
I mean, you kind of do every 4 years over there. You just call them a president. It's the recent ones you seem to revere them like a monarch. It's not where in some countries the presidents are kind of sneered at and made fun of. I think very much in Italy it's more of a joke figure.
Yeah.
I just think the British monarchy is more popular in the United States than ever before. So maybe we do an exchange. Well, by exchange, I just mean, can we send them over to you?
Where's the quid pro quo?
Oh, I think it's a generous gift. You know,
hey, we've got some of them over here already, so we've done our bit.
Plenty more room.
You did want representation, Renee. You can have all of it.
I think we got enough problems here already, or there. I forgetting I'm not there right now, but yeah, in the United States we certainly have our own problems today, and divisions galore. It's troubling. So anyway, we've got just a couple minutes to go before the break. Sean, did you have any remarks that you wanted to get in before we take our break for the first hour?
No, I think it would just be interesting to be able to jump in a time machine and almost bring some of them, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, forward and show them what's happened now and see their reaction, because I'm not sure it's all worked out how they would have been thinking originally.
I'm sure it would be a great shock they're probably spinning in their graves right now. But yeah, I'm sure they didn't envision us being, in as much turmoil and division as we are. Although, they did build in some safeguards. Let's just hope they hold.
And just before, we can't escape the fact that the American Revolution inspired, in part, the French Revolution. But what I was just saying about food prices, just before we get to the break, is this is from, I think, 2008. But for those watching the show, what you can see is the amount of annual income. I do have an updated graph. Which
oh my goodness! Later. But, what a variation!
Yeah, and it's worth noting that those countries that have had a total revolution tend to keep their food prices down. Of course, what we saw during the Arab Spring was oil-rich Kuwait avoiding the revolution by giving everyone 13 months free food and 1,000 dinar. Now, I'm not suggesting that was a big bribe, but it certainly assisted in quelling a revolt in that country.
That sounds like it. Well, this is all really interesting, and we're going to get into some more history and revolutions. And what did you call it? The uprising of the peasants?
The peasants are revolting.
Peasants are revolting.
They don't smell too good either.
Oh, don't say that. Anyway, we're going to be back in just a moment with more of James Martin and Sean Halsall and a little bit more night vision. So please stay with us.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Scrolling all day, time can disappear. Wanna make it count? Why not volunteer?
Posting pics of your food, that takes up time. Time, you've got time to binge all of season 9, though it got so bad.
Time, you got time. We're gonna grow back and be the same browse you had.
Just a few hours to keep families from harm. Help us end home fires, but sound the alarm.
Volunteer for a day to install free smoke alarms in your community.
Discover the Observation Deck, a one-of-a-kind virtual event platform that takes video conferencing to the next level by using avatars to navigate a campus. There's so many areas and activities to choose from. There's a 1,000-seat auditorium, an expo hall, a nightclub, and even a beach. So come attend a conference, take a class, or hear a lecture on the incredible Observation Deck campus. Go to theobservationdk.com.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected, only at kgradb.com.
Welcome back to Night Vision. If you're just joining us, of course, our historian James Martin is here with me, and we have a special guest tonight. Just to recap a little bit, James, we've been talking about revolution and uprising and what actually causes that. And it's generally the people, the regular people who have reached an untenable situation or untenable point, and they've got nothing left to lose, and that's when change really comes. So it's a shame that we can't just initiate change in a reasonable way, but apparently it takes a real revolution. So let's bring back on our guest, Sean Halsall, and I'm going to let you guys carry on. And I know you've got several different revolutions, more than just of the American Revolution, in which we spent the entire hour on, to talk about. But if you would, do point out the similarities among them all, and sort of how to recognize what makes up a revolution and when it's time.
I mean, I think with the American and the French Revolution, it's more than a similarity. There are the same characters popping up in both and interchanging. Obviously, we've got I've completely
Lafayette.
his name. Lafayette. Yes, yeah. Lafayette's popping up, who's a very popular figure in America, and not so much in French mythology. Sort of now He's pretty much a bit of a comedy character over there, where he ushered in anointing a monarch when he brought back the monarchy in France and giving them the nod, where in America he's very much a hero of the American Revolution.
And you've got two other ones as well. You've got foreign ministers and all of this. I mean, there really wasn't long between the French Revolution. I mean, I suppose in a way, we shouldn't look at there's that post hoc ergo propter hoc, because of something, then something. In other words, it's not a case of, the dominoes started to fall. History is incredibly fluid. We're making it at the minute, and, it's a lazy historian that says, because of that, that's why you ended up here. Because we're not thinking about right now, what came, in World War II or the Gulf War or something like that. There are lots of different factors going on for us today. We've got a cost of living crisis in the United Kingdom. The price of energy is skyrocketing around the world. You've got conflict and all of this. There are lots of different factors that we take consideration of today. Well, that's exactly the same back then. But the French Revolution, I would certainly suggest, came really as a result of, in part, the American. France had bankrupted itself to try and give Britain a bloody nose. One of the reasons it didn't ask for the Louisiana territory back is because it simply couldn't afford it. And for the situation on the ground in France, again, was very good for control and all of this. When those soldiers start to return back home and see the state on the ground, that's when things really do begin to shift, and rapidly. I just want to give a very quick overview as to the situation in France at the end of the American Revolution. And I just want to talk about the way in which France is organized. And this is into what's called the three estates. I have been known to call them four because I tend to think the clergy go elsewhere. But you have what's called the First Estate, and there's about 130,000 people in France who were considered to be in the First Estate. These are the aristocracy. They paid no taxes, subject to church rather than civil law, The clergy kept control of education. There was censorship of the press by them. The Catholic faith in France at this point is, practiced by the monarchy. They own 20% of the land. And yes, you've got the second estate with about 110,000 people. They collected taxes. These were often nobles, some low-level clergy, nobility, that kind of stuff. They had a total monopoly of the military and total monopoly of any state appointments, again, paid no taxes. And then you've got everybody else who's in the so-called third estate, and they total 25 million or thereabouts. And that includes everyone, and they pay all of the taxes. You have other obligations. You have the octroi, which is a tax on goods that are brought into cities, a corvée, which is forced road works. You have capitation, which is a poll tax. You have a gabelle, a salt tax, a taille, a land tax. You have feudal taxes to your local lord. And you've just seen a revolution against a monarchy, and things begin to move rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, also the thinkers going on there as well, and the sort of new political ideas being espoused, and yeah, I think that all adds to the tinderbox of what's about to blow up in France once they've just seen an underdog, what would have been at the beginning, be victorious over the big empire controlling it, and thinking we might want some of that.
And of course, I'm just talking, I don't want to just drone on about taxation, because there's, a lot more to tax. Tax is a method of controlling how much money's in circulation, and that's about it, really. But you've got a series of failed harvests, and you have feudal lords, the monarchy, and the church knocking at your door, asking for what they see as their money, and if you've not been able to, raise any yourself, what happens now? Well, it's imprisonment time for you, maybe. It could be straight to the gallows. There's a lot of things, and there's a notion in England of a glorious revolution, which it really wasn't. It was an occupation by the Dutch. But from a French worker's perspective, they're not as the American colonists were in terms of literacy levels. Again, just to repeat, the church had absolute monopoly over education. But for those merchant traders who have seen, in Great Britain, a little bit of democracy's brought in, really for the landowners. They've seen in the Americas, if they've been fighting over there, that there's been a revolt, and it's been successful. And there are some other influences that are then spreading through word of mouth amongst the people of France. Sean, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and again, it's working people getting very, very frustrated with their lot, and just end up snapping. And obviously, we've got the misquoted, I do believe, Marie Antoinette's "Let them eat cake," which I don't believe was ever said by her, but that sort of feeling there, where the aristocracy are paying absolutely no heed to the suffering of the people who do all the work to keep the country running and keep the nobility and the monarch where they are in the luxury they're in. And again, the global sort of context of what's happening and the sort of sea change and how societies are organising themselves then. and the new sort of Enlightenment thinking is spreading out more to the populace.
Yeah, and for the aristocracy, you've also got in France this idea that, well, we've got these estates. Now, there are 3 estates, again, clergy, aristocracy. I tend to argue that, in effect, you've sort of got 4, which is the sort of middle level clergy and all of this. But there are 3 estates. Whether they're 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. History tells us there are 3, obviously. But these estates are the so-called representatives within the French Parliament, which sits at this point, perhaps every 100 years or so. And of course, when there are issues raised by the they are peasants. Let's use the language. They're by the peasants in the third estate, the largest estate. Of course, what happens is they're outvoted by the other 2.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at progress, I mean, it's not just Marie Antoinette with the cake. I mean, that certainly comes later, and it wasn't. There's no evidence that she said it, but it is this idea that bread prices in France had skyrocketed. And she's seen that, she can afford to eat all of these luxuries and we have nothing.
Definitely. And also the sort of anti-Austrian sort of rhetoric in France at the time can't have helped Louis keep control there.
No, and he's an absolute monarch. He's become a joke anyway. He's not sired any children, which is important for the royalists and all of that. And people are assuming things about him and all of that. He's considered a joke. And it all really comes to a head with the establishment, really, on a tennis court of the National Assembly. Okay, well, if you're going to lock out the third estate, then we're not going anywhere. We're going to set up an assembly representing France on your tennis court. And of course, that can be argued was the one of the real start of the French Revolution. Don't know what your thoughts are on that, John.
100%, yeah, and also the sort of forming of the Jacobins and other sort of political groups coming together to discuss how life might look like after they achieve their aims of sort of throwing off the shackles of monarchy there.
I mean, Louis didn't want any democracy. It was, the thought for the royal family at the time is essentially that, it's natural, natural philosophy. God exists. We're part of God. Getting rid of us is pointless. It's, like saying trees shouldn't exist. That's their thought, but for the people, they've got very different ideas. Again, this stems around the notion that if you can't survive, you can't eat, and there are uprisings. I mean, these bakers that are stormed. Just give you an idea, bread prices have shot up, and in order to try and make limited resources go further in France, they're mixing things like glass into bread. The situation on the ground is particularly grim. So of course, they begin to rise. So Sean, what is it that what happens next?
Well, obviously the Bastille is a big trigger point in the storming of the Bastille, kicking off. I'm not 100% sure how that kicked off. I can't quite remember at the top of my head now.
Now, sorry guys. I think a lot of Americans are familiar with Bastille Day, but I don't think anyone really knows what it was about. could one of you or both of you explain exactly what was going on with the storming of the Bastille and why it is that it's celebrated today?
Yeah, the lead up to this, you have a National Assembly, the so-called tennis court oath by the king. He doesn't want a constitutional monarchy, that is to say, limits on his power. He without going into that too much. An assembly's there. You might call it a parliament, a representative assembly, as best as it can be. But the reality of the situation is there are still elements of tyranny. So what it is that you find is a lot of prisoners, revolutionaries, free thinkers, etc., are placed into what's called the Bastille, and the Bastille doesn't exist anymore, but it was a prison. And so the storming of it's interesting because, again, it's one of those accidents of history that have become so symbolic. Here we are with symbols again, because essentially it's the incompetence of a royal army that's camped nearby who begin to hear, that the peasants have arrived. Or what do they want? Your head. In fact, they storm and free. I have to say, I'm not entirely convinced that was the goal. Freeing of these revolutionaries. It was more to get ammunition, I would think. Either way, this is celebrated in France, the Fête Nationale, the national party, if you will, the whatever else. But a lot of this, the storming was triggered by news, word of mouth, that the king had planned to use military force to arrest this National Assembly. That's the litmus paper that is lit, and they storm as a result. Now, there was a royal army really not far away. I can't say in terms of distances, but really not far away. They didn't intervene, and it wasn't because they were pro-revolution. There hasn't been a revolution. This is just at this point an uprising. But there's communication issues, etc., that mean that they don't really intervene. I can't underestimate, though, as the Bastille's been stormed, there are people, taking aim in the Bastille, and all of that. But by the time it's stormed, the game's up. What happens after that is a general uprising. July the 14th, 1789. The people of Paris organized their own governments. They call this a commune. And you have factions, little, groups of people who are trying to control the major city in France, which is, of course, Paris. Now, what's going on elsewhere in France are, everything from tiles being thrown at royal governors to bakers finding themselves bludgeoned to death. They're seen, bakers and things like this are seen as being part of the problem. There's fluidity absolutely everywhere. It's spreading across France. Nobles are being attacked. Any records. This is really interesting from my perspective, because a lot of the goal for people who are uprising outside of Paris and in is destroying records of any due tax. That's what they're doing. They're looking at, they're saying that I owe tax. Let's burn this document. So that's not really a revolutionary thing. That's sort of trying to reset, or they'll never be able to come and find us. But of course, things get serious again very quickly. You've got a lot of what are called emigres, the nobles who are fleeing the country, beginning to see the writings on the wall. We spoke last week, week before maybe, about one priest in this area of France near around the chateau who fled Bigot. He saw the writing on the wall. A lot of people in the nobility and the upper estates, if you will, first and second estates, are beginning to leave. And that includes Louis the 16th. And he's married, as Sean said, to an Austrian.
I thought it was
John.
the 14th. I guess I'm wrong. I'm not
Louis
going
the
to
14th, the Sun King.
Okay.
Sean, I don't know if you wanted to come in there.
Or Louis Capet, as his guards started calling him afterwards. Citizen Louis Capet.
Of course,
Really?
there's another interesting bit of symbology because of course, someone is alleged to have shouted regarding the Knights Templar, Louis Capet, thou art, Templars, thou art sorry, not Louis Capet, what on earth am I on about? The last Templar Grandmaster, thou art revenged, avenged, sorry. Again, nice bit of symbology. Did it actually happen? Who knows? Certain groups certainly believe that. But yeah, what you've got is, this fleeing, really. The king attempts to flee. He's been locked up at the Palace of Versailles. There's this famous, this famous comment he makes to one of his advisors, is it a revolt? No, sire, it's a revolution. He's forced back to Paris. They attempt to force him to sign a constitution, and that's where he tries to run away. And he's then caught. And that is almost certainly the reason why he ended up losing a couple of kilograms in a rapid diet by removing his head from his body. Off he pops. Oh, not quite removing his head, but you know what I mean, metaphorically anyway.
And then Then Marie got the same treatment, didn't she?
I have absolutely no sympathy for her, or actually of any of these people. I mean, yeah, she did.
She was Marie Antoinette was a Habsburg, wasn't she?
She was from the Royal House of Austria. Yes, one of these old ideas of marriage alliances and all of this. Now, again, what begins to happen here? We're in a fluid situation, but the execution of a princess from another royal house in a different country, Austria, is going to declare war on France. And in fact, quite a few other countries do so as well. We can't have the people getting rid of the heads of the aristocracy. We can't have any of this going on. So we need to protect ourselves.
Also, it's important to remember Austria then doesn't have the same borders as Austria now. It was a legitimate empire, and there was a lot of already bad blood between Austria and France. They were by no stretch of the imagination allies at any point. They were competing empires at that time, and that's why it was very controversial that Louis married Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
I mean, in Britain, what's happening as a result of this is the passing of what's called the Combination Act, which essentially restrict the ability of workers in the Industrial Revolution from organising into labour unions. And it should be noted as well that the National Assembly of France, in this period of the King's gone, well, okay, the National Assembly is ruling things. We need to organise a defence against invasion and all of this. they pass legislation which is problematic if you're involved in a labour union or trade union, as we refer to them in Britain, because the National Assembly abolishes guilds and trade unions or labour unions in France. It also goes further, though. You have the Declaration of the Rights of Man, equality before the law. You have the abolition of the special privileges, the tax exemptions for the nobles, things like this. There's freedom of religion, of speech, of the press. You have this, the mantra, the nice symbolic language of liberty, equality, equality, fraternity, and all of that. They introduce the right of the people to create their own laws. Now, there were some things that they certainly got right. There was a notion of the Declaration of the Rights of Women too. And crucially, the feudal system that had existed since Charlemagne really came to an end. The previous, you had intendants who ruled as governors, provinces, very corrupt provinces of France. The provinces are essentially abolished and replaced with the department system, which we have in France still today. And of course, the first and second estates disappear. That's the Constitution in a nutshell. Now, as passed, I think in 1791 too. Sean, I don't know if you want to take up from here.
Yes. Well, yeah, we see the Constitution passed and things seem to be heading the right direction until, as the revolution often does, starts to eat its children. And we see it turn on itself and complete chaos come with a reign of terror where people are getting executed left, right and centre on the same method that they used for Louis not long before. And like I said before, I think that for me comes from a lack of sort of coherent storytelling. Like the Americans very quickly got in place with their struggle against the monarch. It was a bit more chaotic in France, and with there being already established political systems, there were already people trying to manipulate those political systems, and you had the Girondins and the Mountain and the Jacobins all struggling for power.
So they're really opposing the National Assembly at this point. So I should just argue Danton, who's a Jacobin. He's actually the head of the Commune in Paris as well. So there's a lot of factions vying for power. As you say, at this period in time. But yeah, the revolution begins to eat its own. And I should just point out, you have the Assembly, which is pro-constitutional monarchy, and the opposition who are wanting a republic, the abolition of monarchy and titles and all of that. So, Sean, how does it begin to eat its children?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Obviously, there's as there always is in certainly the left wing, we'll probably get onto that, where the terms left and right wing come from, having its sort of foundation here. But yeah, there's always division on how you want to see the world turn out at the end amongst the left. We're very good at having lots of differing ideas and not very good at compromising on how that looks at the end. But yeah, it turns very violent very quick and very sort of witch hunty, finding enemies around every corner. And Maximilien Robespierre, who was the head of the Jacobins, ends up with his heads on the Madame la Guillotine. And
well, I think we should just speak about Robespierre. So, in Revolution, it's interesting because we think of I'm sure Americans think of the revolution in that country as this great, glorious, heroic struggle.
Sure.
And I know in France that's how they see it, and all of that. Revolutions can also go the other way, and let's just say a few phases to the French Revolution, and France had many of them. There's quite a few more to go in France's recent history, but the constitutional monarchists lose power, and you have a convention that's set up with the opposition. They are after a republic, and they are the ones that agree that so long as there are any claims to the throne of France, there will always be a threat to a republic. And that's the principal drive for the beheading, the guillotining of the royal family. I should note that Louis's son wasn't guillotined, he was beaten to death, but hey-ho. Yeah. Sorry, it sounded a bit flippant then, didn't I? Never mind. Robespierre, it becomes the leader of essentially the oddly called Committee for Public Safety, which sounds like one of those boring meetings that you might go to stop people from slipping up in the workplace.
Right.
It's not. As Sean has explained, there's paranoia. There's Robespierre. I mean, does Sean? I mean, I don't know. You think does Robespierre start off as this paranoid person who thinks that he's a deity?
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, from my understanding, he was a very boring and serious man. Background in law. Very straight to the point. He wasn't what you'd think of as a jovial or inspirational character. He's probably a sound strategic thinker, but I don't think he was giving any rousing speeches anywhere or inspiring people to man the barricades. But yeah, that doesn't strike me as someone who'd be naturally averse to paranoia and inwardly looking for enemies everywhere.
No, and you've got at this point the monarchies of Britain, the monarchies of Europe, including Britain, have declared war on France. Vested interests. We can't allow these peasants who've revolted to establish a republic in Europe because then they're going to do the same to us. And so you have the declaration of war against the new French Republic as it's declared. And I think this is where the leader, certainly of the revolution at this point, Robespierre, begins to see enemies everywhere. That rhymed. You begin to see he abolishes the church in France, the Catholic Church, and replaces it with essentially himself. He introduces a new calendar, which is incredibly disruptive, as pleasant as it is. But again, this is adopted by the workers because the new calendar, Germinal, for example, it's all about going back to the land and this idea that, he knows where you've come from.
So was Robespierre considered a positive influence on the revolution? Because I've heard sort of conflicting ideas about him, that he was a kind of a dastardly guy, but
I think you've misheard, Renee. It wasn't the word dastardly. I think it was something else.
I see. But
I think that's the problem with the French Revolution, Renee, is that very few of the characters are either good or bad. It's very nuanced. People who start off heroes become villains very quickly, and it's very confusing.
Yeah. Well, is there anything more that either one of you wanted to include about the French Revolution? Because did you not want to get into Russia, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
I think that's
tie
really
Russia
interesting to
in
people today, especially.
I do just want to mention, because this really, I would kick myself if we didn't mention the period known as the Reign of Terror. Again, this is very much dependent upon your perspective. The guillotine, or what's known as the national razor, is used on, I think it's about 15,000 of the nobility. I am a pacifist and don't believe in, publicly executing people. This said, there is a strongly held belief in some quarters in France that I'm sympathetic to, which is after 1,000 years plus of total repression, starvation, and the true death toll of the revolution is much, much higher, that there is perhaps a sense of revenge against the nobility. However, Robespierre begins to see during the so-called Reign of Terror, there are enemies everywhere. He actually executes Danton. He says that, you've been plotting against, he's the chair of the Committee for Public Safety. You've been plotting against me, you've been conspiring with our enemies. And what's surprising in this period is, despite Europe declaring war on France, it really is holding its own. And there's a few interesting generals who rise to the fore in this period. But,
a young artillery general knocking around somewhere from Corsica, isn't it?
Corsica, yeah. Bonaparte.
Mm.
Who, of course, the last part of the revolution in France is his takeover, and all of that was due to he knew that there was a Swedish music group who wanted to sing about a battle.
I'm sure. If we want to move forward to the Russians, again, I guess there were similar circumstances to trigger that revolution, and not to get ahead of ourselves, but I'd like to also look at, what are there certain elements that are present today that indicate that a revolution might be forthcoming in Russia. I guess with the sanctions that have been put on by the West, people haven't started, starving yet, but it looks like things are getting in great, scarcity there. So are we on the brink, and are there other places in the world that are now at this flashpoint?
The one thing I'd say there, Renee, is for Russia at the moment, it's a very different thing for a country's citizens to be felt like its own government is starving them, and to be able to point at a foreign power and say they're starving them. That if their anger isn't pointed at their own government, their anger isn't going to be unleashed on their own government. It will be turned into anti-American, anti-Western Europe hostility rather than inward. Where all the running theme through the other revolutions has been their own government's faults and not looking after the people and not listening to them. I also think it's interesting with the uprising in France again, a later revolution, the Paris Commune, where they took down the tricolour, and for the first time that I'm aware of, James will correct me if I'm wrong again, but raised the red flag above Paris, because the tricolour had become a symbol of imperialism as well, and that is very definitely that's after the works of Marx and stuff, and people are starting to think about socialism and a different way of organising society, and that very much inspires what ends up happening a good few decades down the line in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
You've got. Just want to say just on that point, because you've got the sans culotte, which of course sort of means without underwear. I wonder whether or not that's the true origin of going commando. Just as an aside there, but yeah, absolutely. You've got the red flag, and again, you've got the symbology there. You know, of red being associated with workers, the blood of workers, the strength and the associations that we see today with that color. Again, it's back to symbology and that idea of coalescing. I just want to forward very quickly because I know, John, over to you on the Russian Revolution, but this notion of anger being directed towards another state is really, really important.
Yeah,
because what we see in counter-revolutionary, and that can be by a government or whatever else, is the idea of a hidden enemy that can never be conquered. That we call it a war on terrorism, for example. Terrorism's a feeling. I'm terrified.
right.
We saw it with the witchcraft trials in the 1600s onwards and before. There's always someone around the corner, there's something like that. And you see this, and this really is a sort of counter-revolutionary. Governments have been around for a long time. Monarchies have, they're very wise to how to distract us from their own failings.
That's absolutely right. And, like you said, Sean, it depends on who the people blame. And of course, with information completely restricted, or not completely, but very restricted in Russia, especially among the older population who aren't quite as cyber savvy and don't know about VPNs and things like that, where they can get outside news. But I guess that's always the case. It's like, you're being fed, a story, and, whatever story you attach yourself to, then that's what you're going to believe. But I wonder if there's not, a point where people, Russian citizens would say, well, why are they doing this to us? And maybe look a little bit deeper and see, what is it everyone's mad at us about?
If that was the case, though, Renee, I think we'd have seen a lot more populaces in the West uprising with the various wars over the years. If we were being told what was going on, I don't think it's strictly a Russian problem. And just back to where we started at the beginning, I think a massive part of the problem is big capital, with like Elon Musk buying Twitter and stuff like that. It's extremely wealthy people with more wealth than any of us could imagine, controlling media and controlling the sort of feed people get and what they consume and what they see. And that's the problem. Whilst these interests have control of these sort of media avenues, it's very hard for working people to see where the problem lies, which it probably isn't a couple of % more tax on billionaires to get free healthcare. It's probably Elon Musk hoarding his wealth, messing around with his rockets in space, and spending his pocket change buying one of the biggest companies on the planet just to control his narrative and sort of, from what I'm reading, paint a pro-Trump narrative for the next election, which is purely the best friend of capital. I mean, I'm not such a fan of either of the parties in America. I don't think either of them serve working American people's interests very well.
No.
But that's a problem the Americans will have to address at some point or another, which, if we have more time, I'm sure me and James could get into the early American labor unions and the amazing things they achieved and how perhaps that could sort of be revived.
And
but
Henry Wallace,
the 8-hour working day, it's all these things came from the industrial American sort of Midwest, and that sort of, it's still there, that sort of mentality. It's just, I think the language has been co-opted, and tainted. And I know me and James were discussing about the meaning of socialism and how a lot of people see it as a dirty word and don't really understand what it is. And
I hear that a lot from people, socialist, they'll call you a socialist as an insult. But I don't think when you question them, well, what do you think socialism is? They don't really know. And it's just a word like communist. It's a word like comrade. Calling each other comrade is a wonderful thing, but it's going to bounce right off the ears of American as being like, oh, commies, and commies is a bad thing. So I think that if people could just understand that we're just talking about different systems, socialism doesn't have a personality. It's a system.
Again, if you look at socialism, I was thinking of how can I convey this in a different way, and I thought, well, humans are born socialist. We depend on other people. It's not babies coming to steal your government or invade Nicaragua or anything. It's children need other people. The idea of us being social animals, because if we weren't social animals, certainly, well, I was going to suggest up until the age of 18, although some people don't leave home until much later. I'm not having a pop at my brother there.
Or my kids.
But that's it. If we were left to fend for ourselves at birth, that's the end of us. And in essence, that's it. And in talking about stopping the accumulation of more and more for these incredibly wealthy individuals, my thesis is it's about time we have money that expires. Most of us run out of money by the end of the month anyway. People who accumulate it, and more and more and more with the people that we assume to have power. I mean, Sean, how does that time with the Russian Revolution? I mean, are there any?
I mean, obviously, we had by the time we get to the Russian Revolution, we had a lot of sort of ex-Russians who'd been exiled out of the country. Lenin, Trotsky, and the like, a few others, are around France, around Belgium, Austria, Switzerland, all meeting in coffee shops, discussing the ideas again. And although, again, I think most people would look back and think they're the people who led the revolution had already started. They just got there as quickly as they could to sort of point it in the right direction.
Didn't Germany weaponize this, though, to try and kick Russia out of the First World War?
Yeah, Germany packed Lenin on a boxcar of a train, if I'm right, and sped him through Germany from Switzerland at the time, I think he was, to try and get him there to sort of spark the revolution and get it going. I think, if I'm right in saying, Trotsky was there a little bit before him and defected from the Mensheviks to the Bolsheviks and all that stuff we would need much longer to go into. Sort of sparked the revolution there, and we see the Soviets being set up and sort of defying everything that Karl Marx had spoke about with needing to have a bourgeois revolution before you get into a full communist revolution, which, as James pointed out earlier, we didn't ever see in Russia. But it's very, very interesting, some of the thinkers there and sort of how they weaponize the proletariat or working class.
I think, and again, we come back to this system. Communism is the absence of capital. And I'll just keep it even simpler than that. Money. The Russian economy the Soviet Union, USSR, whatever you want to call it, in this period from the 20s to the early 90s, is essentially a state-run economy. It's still using money. Some might argue it is I once called it mystical dictatorship. And the reason I say this is because it's just a little tidbit, to stop us being too serious, but it's a very widely held belief that Russian leaders should be bald and then hairy, bald and then hairy, and that's it. It's got some mystical property behind it. Don't ask me about it. It's just the way that it is. And if you look back to leaders, you'll see what I'm on about in that country. But it's interesting, isn't it, that how there was hardship in the Soviet Union in terms of food and the traditional things that really would be the papers that caused the French and the American and the revolutions across Europe in the 1840s and 1848 felt harvest being a key driver there. But in the Soviet Union, when you have failed crops, what's going on? And Sean, I think you said it absolutely right. The enemy is the United States. They're causing this.
Yeah. Yep. That's how they're viewing it because of the information that they have, which is understandable.
We also had an extremely weak leader in the Tsar Nicholas as well, which is a common thread with France. I think that's an extremely weak, absent leader who didn't know how to cope with the slightest bit of adversity when things started going wrong.
Opportunity knocked. You can argue that with George III, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps another thing to add to the list: weak leaders, high food prices, and all of that.
And again, another riot where soldiers opened fire on civilians, sparking mass unrest.
Yeah, so I wonder if the conditions will change. I guess the only way that they would change is if information is flowing freely and people can really think for themselves and make up their own minds. But it's an incredible shame. Obviously, war is just horrible. And when it's completely just unprovoked, I mean, you're just living your life and suddenly bombs start dropping on you. It's just incredibly horrible. And it's really painful and frustrating and everything else to sort of sit by and watch, what happens as the war carries on. It's really tough. I mean, I wish there was something, we could all do.
I think it's worthwhile noting, though, whilst we've looked at some particularly bloody revolutions, there are some examples of democratic revolutions too. So you could look at Britain still at war in 1945, and whilst Winston Churchill seems to have a reputation well beyond his actions across the world, he sent warships to flatten various cities in Britain because of industrial strikes. He was booted out of office in 1945 and replaced with the Labour government of 45, led by a very unassuming person, Clement Attlee, who had some true geniuses around him. Nye Bevan, for example, from Wales, who founded our National Health Service, as well as the building of council houses, state-owned houses for people who previously were living in absolute squalor. There are some, don't rule out democracy yet, is I suppose what I'm saying there. There are some examples of democratic revolutions. Look at your own country, Renee. Who would have thought that a disabled man with a vice president, one of my heroes, Henry Wallace, vice president of the United States, would usher in the New Deal. It's certainly possible.
Of course,
So if we
most
accept,
people didn't realize he was disabled because he was very careful to be photographed standing up and that sort of thing. But yes, who would have ever?
I think compromising photographs and world leaders sort of go hand in hand by this stage. But, when we say, oh, history repeats itself, we always tend to jump for the negative. What we're actually saying is, why haven't we learned? That's the whole point of history.
That's right.
There are some historians who lose their minds because they live in the past. I'm not saying that I haven't lost mine, by the way, but I like to look at history as the instruction book. This is what we need to learn. It's the textbook, isn't it? This is where we failed. But if history did repeat itself, which it doesn't, it just tells us to learn. What we've actually got is good examples too. So, let's really learn those.
Don't forget, I don't want to get all negative and end on that note. There are some very good examples of revolution for the good. Absolutely. But we've got, barely a minute left. It's gone by much more quickly than we ever think it will. So, Sean, I appreciate you coming on, and you'll have to promise to come back and visit with us another time. And, any one of these subjects we covered today, we could have done a whole show on. So
definitely. It's been an absolute pleasure spending the evening with you both. And I'd love to come back sometime.
Oh, I would love it. Thank you so much. And, I hope we haven't scared anyone off with our radical ideas, but I just think it's important to know the whole story, the full story.
Well, just, I know we've got, 30 seconds left, but just to say, those radical ideas, those words that somehow people think are too radical, Marxism, socialism, communism, just bear in mind freedom of speech was once considered a very radical thing to say and was often met with, you can't say things like that. You wouldn't hear many people iterating that today, though, would you?
That's right. And Sean, we're going to be keeping an eye on your political career.
Thank you.
So you'll have to keep us posted over in the U.S. All right. Time's all up. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And I hope you'll be back with us next week for another episode of Night Vision. Take care, everybody.